Let's hear Jim Lampley's 5 most favorite fights from ringside.
I believe the first one I put on the list was Tyson-Douglas.
Yep.
Okay, so
take us through.
The very first fight I ever called on television was Mike Tyson versus Jesse Ferguson on ABC Sports in 1986. And I called Tyson's first several network television exposures on ABC. And then eventually when he went to HBO, I migrated and followed him to HBO. And ultimately what that leads to is Tyson-Douglas in Tokyo. And the interesting sort of setup for that is that the very first prize fight I ever attended live in my entire life was February 25, 1964 in Miami Beach, the Miami Beach Convention Center, when Cassius Clay upset Sonny Liston to become the heavyweight champion of the world. I was a huge Cassius Clay fan. I was there to idolize him. I was probably the only person I knew in my neighborhood, at my school, anywhere, who would have said, oh yes, Cassius Clay is going to win this fight. And he did. And that was, at that moment, the biggest upset in the history of boxing. Fast forward 26 years. And now I'm sitting in Tokyo at 11 o'clock in the morning, calling the fight between Mike Tyson and Buster Douglas. And somewhere in the middle of the fight, when the competitive pattern was fully established and the outcome begins to come into view, I remember thinking to myself, oh my God, the very first fight I ever attended was the biggest upset in the history of boxing. And now I'm sitting here calling the fight, which is going to succeed that as the biggest upset in the history of boxing. So that was the bizarre synchronicity of all that. And then you put that together with me, Larry, and Ray, my first broadcast team at HBO, the bizarre nature of the event, as I say, 11 o'clock in the morning, 35,000 people in the arena, none of them making a sound. You talk about calling a fight with no crowd noise. That was calling a fight with no crowd noise. I mean, it was so silent at the beginning, you could hear the slapping of Douglas and Tyson's shoes on the canvas. And so it was highly unusual, unforgettable in a lot of ways. And I think to this day, on that basis, you would still say that I called the single biggest upset in the history of boxing.
Let's stick with the heavyweights. This has actually happened 3 years ago today as we sit and record this at Wembley Stadium. Wladimir Klitschko, Anthony Joshua.
Max Kellerman calls it, quote, the greatest sports event he's ever seen. Not just the greatest fight, but the greatest sports event. And I know what he's talking about. He's talking about the totality of it all. He's talking about the 90,000 people in Wembley Stadium. He's talking about the anticipation about Joshua taking his place in the line of succession of great heavyweight champions. And we've already touched on that subject with Ali and Tyson, et cetera. So, it was breathtaking even before the bell rang. And then you get a terrific seesaw fight in which both guys are on the canvas. And in the late rounds, either the old veteran champion is going to impose his will and win this fight, or the new, young, vibrant force is going to do that and put his name on that masthead with all of the great preceding heavyweight champions. And Joshua scores the dramatic knockout to create that imprint. It was an absolutely unforgettable event, and I feel privileged that I called it.
June 2013, Foxwoods, Connecticut. Triple G takes on Matthew Macklin.
Well, Triple G was a new entity on HBO over the course of the preceding couple of years. And at that time, we had Boxing After Dark, and we had the main telecast at World Championship Boxing. And Bob Papa was the blow-by-blow guy on Boxing After Dark, and I was on World Championship Boxing. So coming up to the Golovkin-Macklin fight, HBO viewers had seen Golovkin. Bob had called 2 or 3 Golovkin fights. I had not previously called a Golovkin fight, and I hadn't met him. And I had been hearing about him, of course, for years and years because of his long amateur career and because of the buildup in his professional career. So I was excited to be there and to have this experience for the first time with this dynamic and fascinating guy. And the question in my mind going in is, of course, all right, is he going to be everything that he's cracked up to be? How much of this is hype? How much of this is myth making? How much of this is real? And when he landed the body shot that ended the fight, and when Matthew actually screamed at the top of his lungs, I mean, he literally let out a sound like I have never heard from any fighter in the ring. And I believe we were told later that Golovkin had broken his ribs or his rib with that shot. And of course, later down the road against Canelo, you wonder, where did those body shots go? But when you're fighting a great counterpuncher like Canelo, your tactics change. But that night, I'm in a position of sitting there wondering, all right, how much of this is real and how much of this is hype? And when Macklin screams and goes down on the body shot and the fight is over, I'm sitting there thinking, it's real. He's amazing.
February 2000, Mandalay Bay. We'll start with the first fight. Antonio Barrera versus Erik Morales.
Well, you know, I put on the list either the first or the third fights. To a certain degree, all 36 rounds between them are identical, other than the 6 rounds in the second fight when Morales chose to fight more defensively and backed up and fought as a counterpuncher and altered the pace and changed the way the pattern went. But for half of the second fight, all of the first fight, and all of the third fight, this is all-out mayhem. 2 great combination punchers going at each other. Both of them can lead. Both of them can counter. Both of them can deliver hard shots. Both of them can take hard shots. It was breathtaking. And everybody talks about Gatti Ward, and I loved Gatti Ward, but that's not as high a level of technical skill as what you saw between Barrera and Morales. Barrera and Morales, you're looking at 2 of the 7 or 8 most skilled fighters in the whole world, and they are going at each other as though it is a venomous sparring session. I am going to show you who I am. It was incredible to watch, and it was incredible to feel the aura of those 2 fighters at ringside for those fights.
Man, I always get a kick out of it when I see them now ringside next to each other, as friends, because they were such bitter enemies then.
Was never supposed to happen, right? The last thing that you would ever see was Marco Antonio Barrera and Erik Morales sitting together as good friends, and there it is. And that's the beauty of boxing. To me, that's the single most beautiful thing about the sport. It wasn't that shocking that Arturo Gatti and Mickey Ward fell in love. They are to a certain degree the same person. But Barrera and Morales are very different people, and they certainly didn't fall in love. But over a long period of time, they developed a unique respect for each other because nobody else could challenge each of them the way each of them did.
Arturo Gatti, Wilson Rodriguez, March 23rd, 1996, the theater at MSG.
Well, there are a lot of great boxing movies, and in many great boxing movies, there are these little story within the story type segments where you see somebody tear a glove or open a cut, or all the things that you've seen, and you don't often get to see those things graphically live during a fight. But the story within the story of Gatti and Wilson Rodriguez, of course, is Joe Souza, the cut man in Gatti's corner, trying to keep Gatti in the fight with both of his eyes opened up and bleeding. And the literal truth is that Joe Souza tapped Gatti's knee while the referee was counting in front of him to try to see whether Arturo could tell what was going on, showing him fingers, et cetera, et cetera. And every time the referee would show Gatti 3 fingers, Souza would tap Gatti's knee 3 times. And he kept him in the fight that way. And the the shot in the dark knockout in, I think it was the 5th or 6th round, did it again later in a fight against Gabe Ruelas in Atlantic City. That was a Gatti trademark. He's beaten up, he's out of the fight. Whoops, one left hook. That changed everything. And that's the way he knocked out Wilson Rodriguez.
Just unbelievable. Goosebumps on top of goosebumps throughout this entire chat. Thank you so much for joining us here. An awesome list for our listeners out there to go back and watch some of these all-time classic fights. Jim, thank you so much for joining us here. And hopefully we see you ringside. Hopefully we get back watching fights ringside and you're behind the mic where you belong.
I kind of expect that'll happen. Thank you very much.
See you, Jim.